Europe in the early 20th century was a world poised on the edge of catastrophe, though very few truly realized it. From the outside, it was a time of progress, new machines, new industries, and new ideas spread across the continent. Railways connected distant capitals. Telegraph lines transmitted news at unprecedented speeds. Factories churned out goods that had once been unimaginable luxuries. For many, it seemed like an age of promise. But behind that thin veneer of optimism, shadows loomed. Old empires clashed with rising nations, alliances were forged in secrecy, and ancient rivalries simmered just below the surface. It was a world where a single spark could ignite a firestorm. That spark would eventually be a bullet fired on a summer morning in Sarajevo. But to understand why that single act mattered so much, we must first step into the powder keg itself. A Europe divided, paranoid, and armed to the teeth. At the heart of the tension stood two massive powers, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Kingdom of Serbia. On paper, Austria-Hungary was a giant, stretching across Central and Eastern Europe, with Vienna as a glittering imperial capital. But beneath the grand palaces and the stiff uniforms of its bureaucrats, the empire was fragile. It was a patchwork of different peoples. Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, Poles, Croats, Serbs, Bosnians, all ruled by an old monarchy desperately trying to keep control. Serbia, by contrast, was small but restless, driven by ambition. Having recently fought wars in the Balkans, Serbia dreamed of uniting all South Slavs under one banner. This vision directly threatened Austria-Hungary, which controlled Bosnia and Herzegovina, territories filled with Slavic populations who resented imperial rule. In the eyes of Vienna, Serbia was not just a neighbor. It was a spark waiting to set their empire ablaze. But the Balkans were only part of the story. Across Europe, rival alliances had formed, binding nations together in webs of loyalty and obligation. On one side was the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other, the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain. These alliances promised protection, but in truth, they made the world far more dangerous. If one nation went to war, its allies would follow, creating a chain reaction no one could fully control. This was Europe in 1914, a battlefield waiting to happen. Amid this fragile balance stood Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. To many in Vienna, he represented hope for reform. Unlike his aging uncle, Emperor Franz Joseph, Franz Ferdinand was modern, outspoken, and willing to confront the decaying structures of the empire. He believed Austria-Hungary needed to adapt or risk collapse. But he was also a man surrounded by controversy. His marriage to Sophie Chotek, a Czech noblewoman of lower rank, caused scandal at court. The elite saw Sophie as unworthy of a future emperor's hand. Even their children were barred from inheriting the throne. Yet Franz Ferdinand loved her fiercely, refusing to abandon the woman who had captured his heart. To the people of the empire, this made him a complicated figure, both sympathetic and stubborn, both visionary and abrasive. But in the eyes of Serbian nationalists, he was something else entirely, the living embodiment of the imperial order they despised. For Franz Ferdinand himself, the Balkans represented danger and opportunity. He saw the rise of Serbian nationalism as a cancer that threatened to tear his empire apart. His solution was not war, but reform, granting more autonomy to Slavic regions within Austria-Hungary. Ironically, it was precisely this idea that terrified Serbian nationalists the most. If Slavs were given rights within the empire, the dream of an independent Greater Serbia might vanish forever. And so, Franz Ferdinand became a target. In the smoky taverns and backstreets of Belgrade, secret societies plotted against the empire. Chief among them was the Black Hand, a clandestine group of officers and revolutionaries sworn to the cause of Serbian unification. For them, Austria-Hungary was not a legitimate ruler, it was an oppressor. Every act of rebellion, every assassination, was seen as a step toward liberation. In 1914, when word spread that Franz Ferdinand would visit Sarajevo to observe military exercises, the Black Hand saw an opportunity too great to ignore. To strike at the heir of the empire in Bosnia itself, the heart of occupied Slavic territory, would send a message to the world. It would prove that Austria-Hungary was vulnerable, and that Serbian nationalism could not be silenced. Among those chosen for the mission were young men, barely more than boys. Gavrilo Princip was one of them. 19 years old, frail from tuberculosis, he looked like anything but a revolutionary. But inside burned a fire of conviction. Princip believed he was destined to sacrifice himself for his people. Alongside him stood conspirators armed with pistols and bombs, prepared to carry out a mission that would change history. As Franz Ferdinand prepared for his visit to Sarajevo, the empire's officials debated the wisdom of such a trip. Bosnia was a volatile province, and the date of the visit, June 28th, was especially provocative. For Serbs, it was the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, a centuries-old defeat at the hands of the Ottomans that had become a symbol of national identity. For the heir of the Austro-Hungarian throne to appear in Sarajevo on that day was seen as nothing less than an insult. Yet Franz Ferdinand was undeterred. He believed his presence would project strength, showing the world that Austria-Hungary ruled Bosnia with confidence. And so, despite warnings, the visit went ahead. But Sarajevo was not ready. Security was lax, communication was poor, and the motorcade route was publicly announced in advance. In the narrow streets of the city, the conspirators waited, their weapons hidden beneath coats and jackets. They were not hardened assassins. They were nervous, restless, their palms sweating as they rehearsed the mission in their minds. Some doubted they had the courage to pull the trigger when the moment came. Others feared capture and torture. Yet all of them knew that failure was not an option. Their cause demanded sacrifice. Far beyond Sarajevo, the great powers of Europe carried on as if nothing were amiss. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm dreamed of his empire's growing might. In Paris, politicians worried about the balance of power. In St. Petersburg, the Russian Tsar felt the weight of his alliance with Serbia. And in London, Britain balanced precariously between isolation and entanglement. Each nation had its own concerns, its own ambitions, but none suspected that, in just a matter of weeks, the entire continent would be pulled into a war unlike anything the world had ever seen. For now, Europe stood in uneasy peace. But beneath the surface, the gears of fate were already turning. A motorcade was about to drive through the streets of Sarajevo. Young men with weapons were about to make their move. And the first domino of the 20th century's greatest catastrophe was about to fall. Sarajevo, June 1914. The city was restless. Nestled in the rugged mountains of Bosnia, it was a place of crossroads, a mixture of Ottoman heritage, Austro-Hungarian rule, and simmering Slavic nationalism. On the surface, the city bustled with markets, trams, and chatter in cafes. But beneath that surface, it seethed with resentment. To the Slavic population, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was not a guardian of order but a foreign occupier. And on June 28, 1914, resentment would meet destiny. Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Habsburg throne, had chosen that day for his official visit to Sarajevo. It was meant to be a demonstration of imperial strength and unity, a message that Austria-Hungary controlled this volatile province with firm authority. But to nationalists, his presence symbolized oppression. He was not simply an archduke on a diplomatic visit. He was a walking target. The city was full of whispers. News of his arrival spread quickly. For some, it was an opportunity. For others, it was the ultimate insult. Among the crowd that morning were young men who had sworn to strike a blow for freedom, members of a clandestine network that called itself the Black Hand. The Black Hand was no ordinary secret society. Born out of Serbia's tangled web of nationalism and ambition, it had deep roots in the Balkans. Officially, its members claimed loyalty to the idea of a greater Serbia, a unified Slavic state that would break free from foreign control. Unofficially, it was a movement of zeal, radicalism, and ruthless calculation. Its motto was chilling: unification or death. Its members were young, idealistic, and often desperate. They came from modest families, poor villages, and struggling schools. But what they lacked in privilege, they made up for in burning conviction. They believed history had chosen them to act, that their courage or their bullets could change the destiny of nations. Among them was Gavrilo Princip, a frail, sickly 19-year-old who had grown up in poverty and discontent. He looked unremarkable, almost fragile, but beneath his quiet appearance lay a determination as cold as steel. Princip and his companions, Nedeljko Kabrnovic, Trifko Grabez, and others, were armed and trained in secrecy. Their weapons had been smuggled across the border, their plan carefully crafted. Yet like all conspiracies, it was also fragile, held together by luck, improvisation, and the reckless belief that destiny was on their side. The day began with pageantry. Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie, arrived in Sarajevo by train and boarded an open car for the procession through the city. They were both dressed elegantly. He in military uniform, she in a light summer dress. It was supposed to be a ceremonial tour, a chance for the Archduke to be seen by his subjects. He believed it was a matter of duty. What he did not believe was that his life was in danger. But danger lurked at every corner. The motorcade glided slowly down Appel Quay, following the Miljacka River. Crowds lined the streets, cheering or glaring in silence. Tension hung in the air. The conspirators positioned themselves strategically along the route, waiting for their moment. Each man carried bombs and pistols. They knew that failure could mean death, but they were prepared to sacrifice themselves for their cause. The first attempt came near the Kamerja Bridge. Nedeljko Kabrnovic hurled a bomb at the Archduke's car, but the bomb bounced off the folded roof and exploded under the next vehicle, injuring several officers. Chaos erupted. Soldiers and police scrambled. Bystanders screamed. Yet in the smoke and confusion, the Archduke remained unharmed. His car sped forward, the procession in disarray. The conspirators scattered. Kabrnovic was caught almost immediately after trying to swallow a cyanide pill and jump into the river. The pill failed, and the river was too shallow. He was dragged out and beaten by the crowd before police intervened. For the Black Hand, the mission seemed ruined. The Archduke was alive, security was tightening, and panic filled the streets. For Franz Ferdinand, the incident was infuriating but not enough to deter him. He refused to cancel the visit. He insisted on continuing, even as his advisors pleaded for caution. His pride, his sense of duty, and perhaps his underestimation of the threat convinced him to proceed. He would attend the planned reception at the town hall. At the town hall, the Archduke delivered his speech, visibly shaken yet composed. His words were sharp, laced with anger at the attempt on his life. The mayor, embarrassed and nervous, could only apologize. Sophie tried to calm her husband, reminding him that the worst was over. She urged him to be careful, but she stood by his side. She had always been his confidant, his strength, the love he had fought to marry despite imperial disapproval. Meanwhile, outside the hall, the remaining conspirators were lost in despair. The plan had failed. The assassination attempt had been bungled. Their chance, it seemed, had passed. Some considered fleeing. Others froze in fear. But Gavrilo Princip remained. He wandered through the streets, dejected, unsure of what to do next. And then fate intervened. The Archduke's motorcade was supposed to take a new route to avoid danger, but miscommunication sent the cars back onto the original streets. As they rolled past Moritz Schiller's cafe, the driver made a wrong turn and stopped to reverse. At that precise moment, Gavrilo Princip stood just steps away. In a twist of destiny so improbable it seemed orchestrated by the hand of history, the man who had failed hours earlier now had the target of his life directly in front of him. He reached for his pistol. The crowd bustled around him, unaware. The Archduke and Sophie sat exposed in the open car, oblivious to the danger just a few feet away. Princip's hand trembled slightly, but his determination was unshakable. This was his chance. This was the moment that would change the world. And with that, he raised his gun. The echoes of the first bomb still hung in the memory of Sarajevo, but what was about to happen next would resonate far beyond the city, far beyond the Balkans. It would echo across Europe, across continents, plunging empires into war and generations into grief. Because within seconds, 2 bullets would unleash chaos that no one could stop. The day was supposed to be over. The royal motorcade had already been rattled by the failed bomb attempt earlier that morning. leaving one officer wounded and the Archduke shaken but alive. Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie had continued with the schedule, determined not to give in to intimidation. To the outside observer, it might have seemed as if fate had already played its hand and failed. But history, as it often does, had one final and devastating twist in store. Sarajevo, June 28, 1914. The streets were restless, the air still tense after the morning's chaos. Members of the Black Hand, the secret Serbian nationalist group that had plotted the assassination, were scattered across the city. Most of them believed the operation had failed. Some even contemplated fleeing, fearing that the Austro-Hungarian authorities would soon sweep the city with arrests. Among them was a frail, sickly 19-year-old with hollow cheeks and burning eyes, Gavrilo Princip. Princip had grown up in a poor peasant family in Bosnia, marked by hardship, disease, and poverty. To him, the Austro-Hungarian presence in the Balkans was not just politics. It was personal humiliation, a constant reminder of foreign control. He had been trained in secrecy, indoctrinated with the belief that violence was the only tool left to free his people. Yet, as he drifted aimlessly through the streets that day, the young man believed the mission had already failed. The Archduke was still alive, the empire still unshaken, and history seemed to mock their desperate attempt. But then came chance. After attending the official reception at Sarajevo's town hall, Franz Ferdinand decided to change his route. Instead of returning directly along the Appel Quay, he insisted on visiting the wounded officer from the morning attack at the hospital. It was a decision that forced a change in the convoy's direction, one that would prove fatal. The drivers were not informed properly. As the motorcade rolled along the bustling riverbank, the lead car mistakenly turned onto Franz Joseph Street, a narrow road in the city center. The governor of Bosnia, riding with the Archduke, immediately shouted for the driver to stop and reverse. In that brief, chaotic pause, the cars stalled in front of a small delicatessen. Standing just outside that very shop, by sheer coincidence, was Gavrilo Princip. For a moment he froze. The target that had seemed untouchable, guarded by soldiers and police, was now just meters away, stopped, exposed, and within reach. Fate had delivered Franz Ferdinand and Sophie right into his hands. Princip's heart pounded. He reached inside his coat, where he carried a small Belgian-made pistol. As he gripped the weapon, time seemed to fracture. This was his moment, his chance to strike a blow for Serbia, to etch his name into history. With trembling hands but burning determination, he stepped forward. 2 shots. The first bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen. She gasped, clutching her stomach as her white dress darkened with blood. The second bullet pierced Franz Ferdinand's neck. He slumped backward, his face pale, his voice barely a whisper. Sophie turned to her husband, her last words a desperate cry. "For God's sake, what has happened to you?" She collapsed into his lap. The Archduke, blood streaming from his mouth, uttered his final words, "Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." But within minutes, both were gone. The crowd erupted into panic. Soldiers wrestled Princip to the ground, nearly tearing him apart with their bare hands before police dragged him away. The young assassin had succeeded where his comrades had failed. The Archduke and his wife lay dying in their car, their bodies lifeless symbols of an empire's vulnerability. Word spread with lightning speed. By the time the royal couple's deaths were confirmed, Sarajevo was in shock. People wept, others whispered in fear, and many in the empire braced themselves for retribution. To the Austrian authorities, this was no isolated crime. It was an attack on the dignity and sovereignty of the Habsburg throne. But beyond the immediate grief and outrage, the significance of those 2 shots would soon reverberate far beyond Sarajevo. They were not just bullets. They were the spark that would ignite the powder keg of Europe. The Black Hand's plan, conceived in secrecy and driven by nationalism, had succeeded in a way none of its members could have imagined. Princip was quickly arrested, beaten, and taken away for interrogation. As he sat in his cell, broken and bruised, he could not have comprehended the scale of what he had unleashed. For him, it was a victory for Serbia, a symbolic strike against oppression. But for the world, It was the beginning of an unimaginable catastrophe. In Vienna, the news fell like thunder. Emperor Franz Joseph, the aging ruler of Austria-Hungary, was devastated. The murder of his heir threatened not only the stability of his empire but also his legacy. In the smoky chambers of power, ministers and generals argued that Serbia must be punished, that the empire could not afford to appear weak. Yet Austria-Hungary was not alone. The assassination pulled at the tangled threads of alliances that bound Europe together. Russia, the self-proclaimed protector of the Slavs, would never allow Serbia to be crushed. Germany, tied to Austria-Hungary by treaty and loyalty, promised full support in case of war. France, bound to Russia, would inevitably be drawn in. And Britain, though hesitant, would not stand aside if the balance of power collapsed. All of it, the treaties, the rivalries, the arms races, suddenly crystallized around one young man with a pistol. Gavrilo Princip had no army, no throne, no wealth or power. Yet his act would drag the greatest empires of the age into a war unlike anything the world had ever seen. The funerals of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were somber affairs, overshadowed by the political storm brewing in Europe. Crowds mourned, dignitaries spoke of justice, but behind closed doors, leaders whispered about war. The tragedy was transformed into a weapon, a justification for long-awaited reckoning. And still, few could grasp the true scale of what was coming. For many in Vienna, Berlin, and even Sarajevo, the assassination seemed like the spark of a regional conflict at most, a punishment of Serbia, perhaps a limited war. But history had other plans. Because once those alliances were triggered, once mobilizations began, once soldiers marched to the front, there would be no turning back. The shots fired in Sarajevo did not just kill a royal couple. They tore through the fragile web of diplomacy that had held Europe in a precarious peace. The young assassin, shackled and awaiting trial, could never have known that his bullets had set the world on fire. And Europe, unaware of the scale of the storm about to descend, was already stepping toward the abyss. The fatal shots had been fired. The countdown to catastrophe had begun. News of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie spread across Europe like wildfire. Within hours, Vienna was buzzing with fury, grief, and a sense of insult that no empire of its stature could endure without retribution. To the leaders of Austria-Hungary, this was not just the murder of a royal couple. It was a direct assault on the empire's prestige orchestrated, so they believed, not by a handful of reckless youths in Sarajevo, but by the very state apparatus of Serbia. The corridors of the Hofburg Palace trembled with voices demanding action. The aging Emperor Franz Joseph, though weary and cautious by temperament, was surrounded by hawkish ministers who insisted that hesitation would mean weakness. The foreign minister, Count Leopold Berchtold, and the powerful military commander, Chief of Staff Konrad von Hotzendorf, pushed relentlessly for a punitive war against Serbia. To them, the opportunity was clear. If Austria did not crush its troublesome Slavic neighbor now, it might never get another chance. But there was one obstacle: Russia, Serbia's protector. Austria knew that any move against Belgrade could trigger Russian intervention. And if Russia stepped in, it would not stand alone. The alliances that had been carefully woven across Europe like a spider's web were waiting to be tested. And so, Austria turned to its most powerful ally, Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany reacted with explosive anger when he heard the news. His cousin Franz Ferdinand had been killed, and Wilhelm was already prone to bouts of paranoia about encirclement. He believed Germany was surrounded by enemies, France to the west, Russia to the east, and that one day, the inevitable confrontation would arrive. Perhaps this was the moment. And so, Wilhelm gave what historians would later call the blank check. Germany assured Austria-Hungary that whatever action it chose to take against Serbia, Berlin would stand behind it. With German backing, the Austro-Hungarian hawks gained the confidence they needed. Retaliation was not just possible, it was inevitable. Yet weeks passed before Austria acted. The funeral of Franz Ferdinand was curiously muted, reflecting the complicated relationship he had with the imperial court. Many in Vienna had despised him in life for his reformist ideas and his morganatic marriage to Sophie. In death, the ambivalence lingered. But politically, his assassination provided the perfect pretext. On July 23, 1914, Austria delivered an ultimatum to Serbia. It was deliberately harsh, designed to be rejected. 10 demands were listed: suppression of anti-Austrian propaganda, dismissal of hostile officials, and most provocatively, the allowance of Austrian officials to operate within Serbia to suppress terrorist movements. This last condition struck at the very sovereignty of the Serbian state. When the ultimatum reached Belgrade, the Serbian government trembled. They knew that outright refusal meant war, and yet, yielding completely would mean national humiliation and the loss of independence. Serbia tried a delicate balancing act. It accepted nearly all of Austria's demands but rejected the condition that infringed upon its sovereignty. It was a calculated gamble. Serbia hoped the great powers would intervene diplomatically, preventing Austria from acting rashly. But Austria-Hungary, emboldened by Germany's blank check, saw this as defiance. On July 28, Austria declared war on Serbia. The guns of Europe were about to roar. The declaration of war sent shockwaves across the continent. Serbia appealed to Russia, its patron and protector. The Tsar, Nicholas II, hesitated, torn between his role as defender of the Slavs and the staggering risks of a continental war. His generals, however, warned him that Russia could not afford to let Serbia fall, for it would mean the loss of influence in the Balkans. And so, Russia began to mobilize its vast army. This mobilization was seen in Berlin as an existential threat. German war plans, crafted years earlier, assumed that Germany could not fight both France and Russia at once unless it struck quickly. The infamous Schlieffen Plan dictated that Germany must first defeat France with a rapid strike through Belgium, then turn eastward to face the slower-moving Russian armies. Every move on the diplomatic chessboard now accelerated toward catastrophe. The assassination in Sarajevo, meant to send a message of defiance, had lit a fire that no one could control. Inside the palaces of Europe, a tragic irony unfolded. Many of the rulers were related by blood. Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, Tsar Nicholas of Russia, and King George V of Britain were all cousins, descendants of Queen Victoria. They wrote telegrams to one another in desperate attempts to halt the slide toward war, the so-called Willie-Nicky telegrams. But these personal appeals were drowned out by the machinery of militarism. Once mobilization orders were signed, they were almost impossible to reverse. Railroads had been scheduled, timetables printed, and armies were already on the march. The momentum of war was unstoppable. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. And on August 4th, when German armies invaded neutral Belgium, Britain declared war on Germany. Within just over a week, the entire European continent was engulfed in flames. For ordinary people, the outbreak of war was greeted with a mixture of disbelief and jubilation. In Berlin, Vienna, Paris, and London, crowds filled the streets, waving flags and cheering as soldiers marched off. They believed the war would be short, decisive, and glorious. Many thought it would be over by Christmas. But beneath the euphoria, there was also dread. Some could sense that Europe had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The world had changed irreversibly, and it all traced back to a gunshot fired by a frail teenager on a Sarajevo street. In Vienna, the very empire that had sought revenge would find itself weakened by the war it unleashed. In Berlin, the leaders who had offered unconditional support would soon realize they had shackled themselves to a doomed partner. In St. Petersburg, the Tsar who believed he was defending Slavic honor would march his empire toward collapse and revolution. The fuse lit in Sarajevo had burned all the way to the powder keg, and now the explosion tore across the globe. And yet, in those first weeks of war, no one could imagine the scale of the catastrophe to come. Trenches stretching hundreds of miles, new weapons of industrial slaughter, millions dead, a decade defined not by progress, but by chaos and destruction. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand was not merely a spark. It was the match that ignited the darkest chapter in modern history. And in Block 5, we will see how this war, the war to end all wars, unfolded into something even more terrifying: a global catastrophe that reshaped the world for an entire generation. The summer of 1914 was supposed to be filled with warmth, festivals, and the rhythm of everyday life. Instead, it became the opening chapter of the bloodiest conflict the world had ever seen. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand had lit the fuse, and now, the carefully stacked powder kegs of European politics exploded with unstoppable force. Within weeks, the map of Europe was unrecognizable, and millions were being drawn into a war that few fully understood but none could escape. Austria-Hungary, reeling from the loss of its heir, made the first move. Backed by Germany, it issued an ultimatum to Serbia that was designed not for peace, but for humiliation and rejection. Serbia, with the silent support of Russia, refused to surrender its sovereignty. And so, like falling dominoes, the great powers of Europe lined up behind their allies. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized in defense. Germany declared war on Russia, then on France. Britain, bound by treaty, entered against Germany. Within a single month, the entire continent was at war. The assassination in Sarajevo had become the spark for a firestorm that would rage for 4 years, and its embers would smolder for a decade and beyond. The first images of war were filled with confidence. Crowds cheered soldiers as they boarded trains, waving flags and shouting promises of a quick victory. Newspapers called it a glorious struggle, and young men rushed to enlist, afraid they would miss the adventure. They believed they would be home by Christmas. They were wrong. On the Western Front, Germany unleashed the Schlieffen Plan, an audacious attempt to crush France swiftly by sweeping through Belgium. But Belgium resisted, Britain joined the fray, and the lightning strike slowed. What followed was not glory, but mud, blood, and endless trenches stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. The Eastern Front was no kinder. Russia sent wave after wave of men into battle, but German and Austro-Hungarian forces carved through them with modern artillery and machine guns. The human cost was staggering. The war had begun as an act of vengeance for an assassination. It was now a meat grinder swallowing entire generations. But the war did not remain a European affair. It spread like a plague, drawing in colonies and distant nations. Indian, African, and Australian soldiers fought in lands they had never seen, under flags that were not their own. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, opening new fronts in the Middle East. Japan sided with the Allies, eager to expand its influence in Asia. Soon, the entire world was at war, a global conflagration born from a single gunshot in Sarajevo. The irony was not lost on historians. Then or now, a Serbian nationalist had sought to free his people from imperial domination. Instead, his act triggered a war that would lead to greater suffering, collapse of empires, and redrawn borders that would haunt the world for the rest of the century. The war turned into a slaughterhouse, trenches filled with corpses. Gas attacks choked men to death in their masks. Shells shattered landscapes into lunar wastelands. The Battle of Verdun alone cost nearly 1 million casualties. The Somme took even more. Families sent sons, and the earth swallowed them whole. And the dream of home by Christmas turned into 4 endless years of agony. By 1918, more than 16 million people were dead: soldiers, civilians, men, women, children. Another 20 million were wounded, many maimed for life. Villages disappeared. Cities were reduced to rubble. The very soil of Europe was poisoned with lead, shrapnel, and human remains. The war did not merely claim lives, it devoured nations. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, torn apart by the very nationalism it had tried to suppress. The Ottoman Empire crumbled, leaving behind bitter disputes in the Middle East. Tsarist Russia disintegrated in revolution, paving the way for Bolshevik rule and the rise of communism. Even Germany, once the confident giant of Europe, was left shattered, humiliated, and stripped of power. The old order of Europe, the aristocracies, the dynasties, the empires, died on the battlefields of World War I. And all of it traced back to that single June morning in Sarajevo. The decade after the assassination was one of chaos. Even after the guns fell silent in 1918, peace never truly returned. The Treaty of Versailles punished Germany so severely that resentment brewed like a poison in its veins. New nations were born out of fallen empires, but their borders were drawn with little regard for history, culture, or identity. Conflicts simmered beneath the surface, waiting for their chance to erupt again. It was not a decade of peace, but of uneasy silence. Revolutions broke out. Economies collapsed. Fascism rose in Italy. Seeds of Nazi ideology sprouted in Germany. The United States, having entered the war late, retreated into isolation. The world had changed forever, and not for the better. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand had not just triggered a world war. It had unleashed a chain of events that defined the entire century. It is tempting to imagine an alternate history. What if Gavrilo Princip had not pulled the trigger? What if Franz Ferdinand had survived and taken the throne of Austria-Hungary with his ideas of reform? Could the Great War have been avoided? Could millions of lives have been spared? The truth is, the world may still have been destined for conflict. The alliances, the rivalries, the arms races, all of them pointed to an inevitable clash. But the assassination provided the spark. And history shows us that sometimes, all it takes is one spark to set the world ablaze. The shot in Sarajevo did not just kill a man. It killed an era of optimism, of belief in progress, of faith in human reason. It shattered the illusion that Europe's leaders had control of their destiny. And it opened the door to the bloodiest century in human history. When we look back at the 20th century, the wars, the revolutions, the genocides, the rise and fall of empires, we often forget how it all began. Not with tanks rolling across borders, not with bombs dropped from the sky, but with one young man, standing in a crowded street, pulling a trigger. That single act of violence became the doorway through which chaos walked into the world. And it reminds us of a haunting truth. History does not always turn on the decisions of great men in marble halls. Sometimes it turns on the choices of a single person in a single moment. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was not the first act of political violence in history, nor would it be the last. But it remains perhaps the most consequential. A single bullet did not just end a life. It set fire to an entire century. And so, the question lingers for us, even today. How fragile is the world we live in? How many unseen tensions lie just beneath the surface? And how close might we be, even now, to the next spark? Because history has taught us one thing. It only takes one moment, one choice, one act to change everything. If you found this story as chilling and eye-opening as we did, don't forget to subscribe for more untold histories that shaped our world. Because sometimes the smallest events create the largest shadows.